Hello everyone, welcome back. Today's case is on the disappearance and brutal murder of 16-year-old David Grunwald. This horrific case takes place in 2016 in Palmer, Alaska, which, despite today's topic, is a beautiful-looking city with gorgeous mountain views in the Matanuska Valley. With a population around 6,000 people, Palmer is around 45 minutes outside of Alaska's largest city of Anchorage. But this beautiful backdrop would be the setting of something very horrific. David Benjamin Grunwald was a 16-year-old boy just living in Palmer, trying to have a chill night with friends the night of his disappearance. David was born in the 2000s to his parents Benjamin and Edie. He was 6 feet tall, 150 pounds, with bluish-green eyes and short brown hair. He was interested in engineering and wanted to eventually become a pilot. He was outgoing and well-liked, also having a 17-year-old girlfriend named Victoria. David just looked and sounded like your average teenage boy. On November 13th of 2016, David would be hanging out at his home with his girlfriend Victoria. Around 6 p.m., he let his parents know he was going to be driving Victoria home, and this should have just been a very quick drive. She wasn't that far away from him. After dropping Victoria off, however, David would call his parents back and let them know he was going to stop in at a friend's house on the way home and that he wanted a little bit extra time to come home because it turns out Eric had a curfew at 9 p.m., so his mother ended up pushing the curfew to 9:20 p.m. so that he'd have some extra time to get home. So David would end up at his friend Eric Allmendinger's house. Now, Eric was a fellow classmate at Colony High School. There would also be another teen named Dominic who was also hanging out at the home that night. So the three boys decided they were going to go out back of Eric's home to this old 1971 camper that was in Eric's backyard. And in this camper, they were going to smoke some weed and drink some beers. But as far as I've seen, David was only going to smoke some weed because he had to drive home. However, as the night went on, David would not return home. And as his curfew came and went, he still wouldn't return home. He was radio silent. By 11:30 p.m. that night, David's parents would end up calling the local police department and report their son hadn't returned home. Again, it was very unlike David. He was a very responsible 16-year-old boy, it seemed like. So thankfully, when David's parents called, the police actually ended up taking this seriously, which is refreshing because we see way too many times in cases like this where the police are just blowing it off because they're a teenager and they're probably just out joyriding or something. When the police arrived, they ended up speaking to David's father, and he suggested that David possibly could have driven Eric to Anchorage. So the police would then begin the search for David and his Bronco. They would stake out highways and look through parks. Again, this is a pretty remote, wooded town. There were so many places that David could have been, but they immediately launched their search and started looking for the teenage boy. The next day, on November 14th, somebody ended up calling the troopers and reported that they had found a Ford Bronco that matched the description of David's vehicle. The location of this vehicle was around 20 miles from Victoria's home, which is the last known place David was ever seen. At this point, they hadn't actually confirmed that David had ever been at Eric's home. But when police would end up finding this Ford Bronco, it had been burned, like completely torched.
David's vehicle was discovered yesterday afternoon up this back dirt road in Wasilla. Now, it had been burned to a crisp, but David wasn't inside. And back at his home, his mother is certain that somebody knows where he is. David is a student at Matsu Career and Tech High School. His mother says he spent Sunday night at the house studying with his girlfriend. He'd left to take her home, and that's the last time his mother saw him. Around 11:30 that night, she called troopers and filed a missing persons report. Troopers were able to ping his phone yesterday morning along the Palmer-Wasilla Highway, but his mother says no calls or text had been sent since Sunday night. His debit card hasn't been used either. Monday afternoon, David's car was found abandoned and burned on a trail off Church Road. His mother says all of this is extremely out of character for her son.
We don't know anything. We don't know where he's at, what his situation is, where he is, if he's crumpled up somewhere, hurt, or somebody has him against his will somewhere. We don't have any idea. And the more the time goes on, the harder it gets. Praying that he's either okay or he will be okay, but we're both extremely fearful that there's been foul play because there's nothing so far. This shouldn't happen to anybody. I've never felt anything like this before. David's a good kid.
And we all know that finding a burnt out vehicle is never a good sign. Clearly, someone burns a vehicle for nefarious reasons, whether that be to hide evidence, a stolen vehicle, etc., and it was not looking good that his vehicle was found in this condition. Meanwhile, police and locals were searching for any other signs of the missing teenager. One of the women from his church even handing out flyers at a local shop.
Now searchers are looking for any trace of Grunwald from in the woods to around businesses near Palmer and Wasilla.
Okay. If you've seen his truck or if you have heard anything, you can call the numbers that are on the bottom of the flyer. Okay.
The more Grunwald's face is seen around the Matsu Valley.
Hi, ma'am. We're looking for this young man. He's been missing since last Sunday. He's a very good kid. He and his family, we love him.
Police would also spend the next couple days attempting to get in touch with Eric, who seemed to be trying to dodge the police. They were eventually able to contact him, and they arranged an interview for the 16th. Now, Eric's interrogation videos are all over YouTube. I definitely recommend going and watching them. But Eric's got some stories. According to Eric's initial story, he had no idea what had happened to David, claiming that he hadn't even seen David in like 2 or 3 weeks. At one point, he did magically remember that David had dropped off a mutual friend at his home the night of his disappearance. Eric was also at this point in time sticking to a story that he had taken a cab to a party in Anchorage that night and that he had went alone. And it seemed like police had nothing other than a burned out car. Weeks would pass with no answers until December 2nd rolled around, when a tip would lead police to discover human remains about 20 minutes outside of Palmer. And these remains would eventually be identified as 16-year-old David Grunwald. David's body was found in a remote wooded area and had frozen due to the low temperatures, but the cold wasn't his cause of death. David's body showed signs of being beaten, and he had a gunshot wound to the head. Autopsy would also later show that David had over 34 bruises as well as a gash in his scalp. The next day, on December 3rd, the discovery of his body would be announced.
I thank all of you for help looking for him and being there for me. He was an amazing person, and he will forever be in my heart.
Along with the arrest of 16-year-old Eric Allmendinger, who was being charged as an adult for first-degree murder and kidnapping. It would turn out that during those few weeks after David had disappeared, police were collecting a substantial amount of evidence. Authorities would determine that Eric's story about going to a party in Anchorage that night was a load of bullshit based on camera footage and additional interviews. Thanks to Eric's never-ending lies, police were then able to obtain a search warrant for Eric's electronics, including a Samsung tablet. And this tablet ended up pinging near the area where David's Bronco had been burned. There was also this lovely photo of Eric that had the word Killas on it. An investigator would also find surveillance footage from an area in Palmer that showed 3 young males who took a partial ride from a home behind a charter school in the valley near Eric's home. After all of this, the courts would approve a search warrant for Eric's home and property. At Eric's home, authorities would discover an overwhelming aroma of bleach coming from that trailer in the backyard of Eric's home that the boys were supposed to have been smoking and drinking in that night. Multiple areas would also test positive for blood. There's also a moment in the interrogation when Eric's father is telling him that they did a really bad job cleaning up the blood inside of the trailer because the authorities had shown Eric's father photos of blood splatter that was left.
It's over. Okay? I just saw the pictures of the inside of my trailer. You guys did a really shitty job at cleaning up all the blood splatter everywhere. Don't. Can I see it? It's very important. Okay? I can't help you if you don't help me. Okay? We've all had enough of the lying for so long now. Now is the time. The DA has said, if you cooperate, things are going to go a lot easier on you.
So if you didn't pull the trigger, we need to know that. If you just stood by, we need to know.
I can't believe my son would be a part of this. Of all things. We want to know why.
Why?
What did he have that you wanted?
Nothing.
Then I'm alright.
Somebody.
Didn't I just say I didn't have anything to do with this?
Why is it in our trailer then?
I don't know, didn't it get broken into? No.
It really did, though. Eric, you need to stop this. This is enough. You fancy yourself smarter than everybody else. You're beat. You've lost. The opportunity now sits in front of you to take advantage of a chance to come clean and take responsibility for your portion, move on with life. You're 16 years old. You got your whole life ahead of you.
After looking at the picture, I didn't even realize that my rug runner was gone. Because you had to get rid of that. That's where my green extension cord is. Because you used it to tie it up around David.
The green extension cord is at Melissa's house. We brought it there. That part's true.
Then why didn't you tell me that when I asked about it?
Because you didn't know where I was. Why don't you tell them where you were? I was at Melissa's house. Well, that's only partially true. Why don't you start at the beginning? I started the beginning with you, and he already knows as much as you know.
Okay,
That's where you're wrong, Eric.
Cindy, when this happened, you were home when David walked in the back door. You had been with him earlier?
They also would discover that there were like rugs and stuff taken out of the trailer and just a bunch of things that were missing from the trailer. In further interviews, police would figure out that Eric had confessed to a peer that he had killed David. Now, when I seen that interrogation footage, I was so glad that Eric's parents weren't pulling the old, like, he would never do that. My sweet little boy would never hurt someone. I'm so glad they didn't pull that card because we see it happen so often with parents. And on one hand, I can understand that's your child. You want to believe the best for your child and the best in your child. But clearly, these parents were both shocked and angry about the situation, and they wanted answers. Now, we also have to remember that there was another teen at the home that night, and this teen was named Dominic Johnson, who was also 16 years old. And Dominic was proven to be there that night. Dominic is also the one who turned out to have led police to David's body. So we have all of this evidence, but that doesn't answer what happened to David that night. Why did David have to die? How did David's night go so wrong? He had simply went to drop off his girlfriend and then wanted to go over to a friend's house to smoke some weed or buy some weed. There's kind of conflicting stories about that. Nowadays, weed is pretty legal all over the place. I don't know if it's legal in Alaska, but it's legal in Canada. It's legal in a lot of states in the US. You know, going to smoke some weed with a friend is such like a common, normal thing now. How did that turn so wrong? And marijuana is not known to make people violent. It usually makes people do the opposite. It makes them chill out. It makes them relax. So why would a situation where a teenage boy is going to hang out with another teenage boy to smoke some weed turn into him dying? How did David go from having a chill night at a friend's house to being found in the woods, beaten, and shot? But let's get into what is thought to have happened the night of David's death. Hours before the murder, Dominic was allegedly captured on video saying something about hitting someone, and I quote, "as hard as I can in the head just to try to hurt him," unquote. We'll get into more about the individuals involved in this case and what is thought about them a little bit later. So that night that David stopped over at Eric's home, they were in fact out back in that camper, smoking some weed and drinking some beers. And everybody thought it was just David, Eric, and Dominic. Well, it turns out that there was actually 2 other boys there as well that night. 16-year-old Bradley Renfro, as well as 19-year-old Austin Barrett. Now, David didn't know any of these boys besides Eric, but it's thought that it all seemed to go downhill after David allegedly smoked all of the weed. You heard me right. This was all allegedly instigated because David smoked the last of the weed. This case pisses me off. David was then locked inside of the tiny bathroom in this trailer while Dominic told Eric to go get his gun. When they eventually let David out of that bathroom, they began to use the gun to pistol whip till he was bloody, half conscious, and pleading for his life. The teens then dragged David across the yard, forced him inside of his Ford Bronco, and began to drive towards Knik River. During the drive, David begged them to take him home, but someone allegedly said, "You're not going home tonight." The teens then walked David into the woods and shot him in the head. It's just depraved and so fucking senseless what happened to the sweet kid over weed. The very next day, the boys all hung out again and they drank together, which was shown in photographs shown during court. All of their phones also pinged in the same area. Now, it's never been proven who fired the fatal shot that killed David, but Eric is thought to have been the ringleader. According to authorities, Bradley Renfro, and I quote, offered suggestions on where the murder should take place and planned to destroy evidence and brought gasoline to burn Grunwald's vehicle after the murder was committed, end quote. Now, in a turn of events, a 15 would also be arrested named Devin Peterson. And Devin was the one responsible for disposing of the gun as well as torching David's Bronco. David's mother, Edie, will be quoted saying, and I quote, David had entered the devil's lair and had no idea what was in store for him. He opened the door and felt his skull scream. He put his arms up, getting hit and bloody, crying, "Why? Stop!" Hearing laughter. Dragged to his Bronco, hearing whispers of guns and killing. Pushed into his back seat, and then asked, "Where are the keys?" A long, long time for any one of these guys to change the course of everyone's lives. But they stuck to the plan, finally stopping, pulling David out of his own vehicle, walking him deep into the woods with his sweatshirt and slippers on. The group stops. David looks up. I can see, feel, hear the click of the trigger. Instant noise and searing blackness with white dots. David's soul is no longer in his body. They left his beaten, broken, and brain-blasted body there, an empty shell, slowly oozing what gravity is pulling out. No heartbeat, no breath, no life. They ran away with the intent of no one ever finding him as his body quickly cooled, froze, and frostbite settled in. It's too bad this is what we're left with, but it's what we have. There's no do-overs. This is the new normal, unquote. David's girlfriend, Victoria, also had a lot of wonderful things to say about her deceased boyfriend. And in full transparency, I cried reading what she had to say about David because he seemed like such a gentleman, such a sweet, sweet guy that didn't deserve any of this to happen to him. He could have had an amazing life if these boys just didn't decide to kill him for no reason. And honestly, that leads me to wonder if they were jealous of him because from everything everyone had to say about David, he was amazing. Victoria was quoted saying about David, and I quote, I'll never forget the many times he told me he loved me, the many times he told me he was going to marry me. He will always have a very special place in my heart. He was very old-fashioned in many ways, especially with dating. I was extremely lucky to be introduced to such a gem. He never let me open a door. He took me on real dates. He picked me up almost every Friday at 6 p.m. to take me out to a nice dinner. He said, yes, ma'am, and no, sir, end quote. And I also seen a lot of photos on David's Facebook where, he was in the kitchen cooking with Victoria. They, were cuddling. They just seemed like such a great pair. And it's a tragedy that they never got to grow old together. And it's also just the fact that despite all of these lovely memories that people have of David, they all also know how his life ended. It was brutal and it was traumatic and it was just absolutely disgusting. He was literally begging for his life. And I can't imagine how terrified he was, especially since this seems to be over literally nothing. Just a group of boys who just decided they wanted to kill someone. And I know I did mention that it's thought that it was over weed being smoked, but there also seems to be a lot of people who think that that was just an excuse to kind of victim blame David, to say, oh, he smoked all the weed, so we killed him. Like, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that his own mother, Edie, has to see photos of her son's body. She literally printed this photo of David's body being found in the woods frozen. And that is the last memory she now has of her son. And it's the fact that she has to know that he was begging for his life. And these boys just didn't care. They just didn't care. They could have just taken him home. They could have dropped him off somewhere. He was still alive. But they instead took him to the woods and they shot him. And thankfully, we can have the comfort of knowing that none of these boys got let off easy. None of them.
First look at the 5 teenagers arrested in connection to David Grunwald's murder.
Eric Allmendinger, Bradley Renfro, Dominic Johnson, and Austin Barrett face murder and kidnapping charges. Allmendinger, Renfro, and Johnson also face a tampering with evidence charge. And Devin Peterson is charged with tampering with evidence and hindering prosecution.
Despite leading authorities to David's body, Dominic was sentenced to 99 years in prison. The judge describing Dominic saying, and I quote, there was something off in all 4 of these young people. I don't know what motivated him to do that, but it was not normal. It was flat out scary, end quote. It does, however, turn out that Dominic did not have a great upbringing. And, I can see that trauma and that abuse leading to a child and a teenager to doing bad things. But on the other hand, there are so many people who experience such traumatic things and they don't do bad things. So I don't think it's an excuse, but I do think it's interesting to think about. His attorney citing that Dominic's life was chaotic. He didn't know who his father was. He was raised by his grandmother until he was 12 years old, and then he moved back in with his mother before getting kicked out of the house at 16. On Thanksgiving, Dominic spent his time at a store using their free Wi-Fi, and he was essentially homeless. There's no reason for a 16-year-old boy to be homeless. I don't know why this happened to him, what he was doing. These kids all seemed like thugs, I'll put it that way. They wanted to be like these badass, cool, like gangsters, and they weren't. They were just loser teenage boys. I'm gonna say it. So as I said, at the time around David's murder, Dominic was essentially homeless. He was couch surfing, and he was also sleeping in a shed in below freezing temperatures. Again, a 16-year-old boy shouldn't be living in a shed in the middle of winter. But that was the reality of Dominic's life. It's no way for a teenage boy to be living, but there's also no reason to brutally murder another peer. There's just not.
In November of 2016, Eric thought he was the baddest and the coolest and the smartest 16-year-old around. He dressed like in the latest LA gang fashions. He flashed gang signs. He posed with a gun. He thought he had cool friends. And on November 13th of 2016, two distinct kinds of friends showed up at Eric Allmendinger's house. On one hand, there was David Grunwald, all-American kid, nice family, loving home, steady girlfriend, had his own bank account, saved up and bought a car, all-American kid. On another hand, another group of kids showed up. What did the kids have in common? They liked Eric's marijuana.
Eric would also be sentenced to serve 99 years in prison on multiple different charges. Keep in mind, Eric did deny pulling the trigger, but all of the other boys blamed it on him and said that he was the ringleader, which we have to remember, it was Eric's gun that was used to both pistol whip David and shoot David. It was also Eric's friend. Now, despite Eric trying to be this tough guy during his interrogation and during court, showing no emotion, he'd in the end be quoted saying, and I quote, "I claim full responsibility for Dave dying. He was my friend. He was a good kid, and I killed my friend. That's what happened. I killed somebody's nephew. I killed somebody's son. I destroyed somebody's family." End quote. Now, despite trying to seem remorseful, it seems that Eric hasn't learned anything in prison, however. It seems that Eric repeatedly violates the jail rules. He's been caught making homemade knives. He's fought with inmates, and he's also assaulted a CO. So it doesn't seem like he's learning any lessons here. Judge Heath will be quoted saying about Eric, and I quote, "Mr. Allmendinger was the only one that really knew David. He knew him as a friend, as he stated. Why would he turn on a friend is beyond me. I really don't understand it. He had done nothing wrong. For whatever reason, he chose to turn on him." End quote.
This is totally out of the blue for you, right? You were completely surprised by this attack on David Grunwald.
It happened very quickly when it happened, sir, yes.
Out of left field, you never expected it.
Absolutely not,
And there were no discussions about it beforehand.
No, sir.
And Dominic Johnson was never advising you that he was texting Eric Allmendinger to get the gun.
No, sir.
And you don't remember any of the statements, whether the statements about David talking shit were true or not, because you don't remember those statements at this point.
No, sir.
Bradley Renfro would end up being sentenced to 105 years in prison with 30 years suspended. Now, I'm not sure why he initially got more time, but with the suspension, it's less time than everyone else. So I'm not sure. I didn't really watch his trial because each boy had their own trial, and it was just, I honestly could care less. Either way, they murdered David. We don't have a reason why they did it. And sitting through hours of staring at these kids' faces, I just couldn't waste my time doing that. It's just, they're a waste. Austin Barrett would receive a 65-year sentence with 20 years suspended, meaning he's kind of serving the least of a sentence because that's about 45 years. But he does have to serve a mandatory sentence of 15 years, at which point he'll be held for discretionary parole. Devin Peterson would receive the lightest sentence of them all of only 6 years because he only got charged with tampering with evidence and hindering prosecution. So he was not charged with anything to do with the murder. However, despite that, Devin was also accused of several other crimes aside from tampering with evidence that led to a whole nother trial that I seen when the police looked into all of Devin's, electronics and everything because of David's murder, and he was then charged with CP. CP. According to authorities, Alaska State Troopers obtained a search warrant for Peterson's cell phone, and investigators found a video showing the essay of an incapacitated 15-year-old girl. Disgusting. Now, as I said, there's like a whole other investigation with that, and it seems that he was tried. There was like a whole essay thing that happened with him. So if that doesn't just show that all of these teenage boys were just absolutely deplorable, I don't know what does. On top of that, it would come out that Austin Barrett, and Devin's brother may have been involved in the death of another 16-year-old boy. 5 months before David's murder, a teenage boy named Frank Woodford would suffer a gunshot wound to the chest inside of a residence where both Austin and Damian Peterson were in the home. And what makes the death of Frank Woodford even sadder is that when paramedics arrived, Frank was still alive, and he told the medics that he hadn't shot himself. There was a quote that read, and I quote, "At that point, one of the medics stated, 'You are not going to survive this. We need to know what happened.' And Frank once again told them that he had not shot himself." Now, Frank would later die in hospital, and the case was just shut. It was just considered an accident. But now that all of this has come out, it leads to everyone questioning, and I'm pretty sure his case has been reopened. And that leads to the question, was David's murder the first brutal death to happen in the area by these teens? In the end, I just can't get over the fact that a group of 16-year-old and a 19-year-old boy would decide to just spontaneously murder one of their own, especially since Eric knew David. He was friends with David. I know the others didn't know David, but it's the fact that this was said over and over again to not be premeditated, and it's thought to have not been premeditated, it just kind of happened. That's what's so fucking scary about this case. There was even quotes from some of the parents of the children that were charged where they said that their child just wanted to kill. And knowing that, it makes me scared for my own loved ones who go and hang out with their friends to, smoke some weed or have some beers. What if one of their friends just one day decides that one beer is too many or he didn't pass the joint around enough times? It's deranged. And I don't want us to all live in a world where we're in constant fear of everyone else, but in cases like this, it really presses the fact that you never know who to trust anymore. It could literally be your own friend, your own smoking buddy. And again, weed is supposed to be a drug that, is relaxing and everyone chills out. It's not like they were, all super drunk and doing hard drugs and one thing led to another and they snapped. You know what I mean? And that does make people question if the reason of all this happened was because of marijuana or if it was literally just because these kids wanted to kill someone. But in the end of the day, we don't really know because none of them actually gave a solid reason why. They just said it was because of weed. Now, a lot of people's theories that I did see, however, were that this group was jealous of David for having the life that they did not have. David had his life together. He had a job, he had a car, he had a beautiful girlfriend, he had a nice family. He went to church. And the rest of them seemed like losers, for lack of better words. They were all involved in the local drug scene. They thought they were gangsters. Austin Barrett also posted this half-ass rap video on YouTube that I'll play for you.
Fresh freestyles, fresh air, motherfucker, we don't care. Up here in Alaska, it's cold as fuck like our hearts in our trucks. Motherfucker, what? We got sports cars too and drifting gurus. When you think of us, probably didn't think much, but I'll tell you what, we're takers of fame and game, and your women, country living. Don't fuck with us, I may talk a big game, but I'm truly honestly chasing that fame.
These boys thought they were cool. They thought they were badass, but really they were just big bullies with, a couple of fucking Skittles rattling around their heads. And they took it out on the one kid who wasn't like them. My heart goes out to David's family, his girlfriend, and his friends. In the end, I think it really shows how loving and close this community was because they all rallied together to raise money for Victoria so that she could get a dog to help her with the loss of David. Her GoFundMe reading, and I quote, "My name is Victoria. After the murder of my boyfriend and best friend in November, I've been struggling every day and trying to be strong and process this horrific tragedy. It's been 6 years now, and I really hope she's doing okay. I really hope that she can have a very lovely life. And I hope that, again, David's family is also doing well." Regarding these 5 boys, I hope that every day in prison for them is a living hell because none of them deserve to ever be out again, in my opinion. But let me know how you feel. Does this case freak you out and disgust you as much as it has me? But that is the end of today's case and the murder of David Grunwald, who should still be alive to this day, living his life and getting married and having children just like all of the other victims that I talk about that were brutally murdered for literally no reason. With that, let me know if there are any other cases that you want me to cover. If you're also not subscribed, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because it's a free way to allow me to continue creating content like this, as well as allow me to spend more time creating content like this. With that, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.